Hello, and welcome to FHIR Subscriptions Part 2. My name is Gino Canessa, and today we're going to go through the implementation guide and the new resources added in R4B. This is in preparation specifically for Connectathon 28, but it is a good general overview of an implementation guide and the subscriptions functionality in particular. It is currently the third week of August, so there may be a few minor changes, but if there's anything too serious, then I will record a new video and replace this one. So, with that said, there's a lot to do. Let's jump right in. Here I am starting off with the Backport Implementation Guide itself. As always, the links are going to be found from the GitHub pages I link below, and they will all be there. So, the first thing I'll note is that right now this is pointing to this argonautproject.github.io URL, and that is because of some build issues with the auto builder and R4B and new resources and a lot of things that you don't need to worry about too much, but it is good to know. Typically, the latest builds are found at build.fhir.org. And so I want to call out this specifically so that there's an understanding as to why this is not at that type of URL. When you open up the IG, this is a standard HL7 templated IG, so it has the traditional yellow and red, or hot dog and mustard for people that are familiar with that theme in Windows from a long time ago. The main page, as with all of the HL7 templated IGs, there's a navigation bar up here, which hopefully things are named so that they make sense. And there's also, I'll call out the footer, which has things like propose a change, which should be linking to Jira. So the main page here is this home page, and really this page is just kind of the table of contents for everything else. And we've tried to put things in order here so that it's kind of the logical order if you were starting and wanted to learn everything about it. That said, just also call out right now, if you do have any questions or comments or anything else, please reach out. Try to check the YouTube messages, but also on Zulip. There's a subscriptions stream, and that should be linked as well. And that's the quickest way to get any of these kinds of things if there's a question or something you think could be more clear. With that said, we'll start off with background. Now the background page here should be pretty familiar if you watched part 1 because it has a lot of the same content. This is just describing, what are subscriptions, how they were defined in DS2 to R4, the changes we've made to R5, and now the Backport IG. We also do have some what are called Dnr Boundaries and Relationships, and that's specifically we're calling out FHIRcast and FHIR messaging and kind of trying to give that overview, which I also mentioned during that other video. The last thing is kind of the purpose behind the IG, why it exists, why it's here. And again, as we've discussed, the trick here is to make these topic-based subscriptions that we defined in R5, are in the process of defining for R5 since it has not been published yet, and make them available in R4 because R5 is a bit too far in the future for a lot of implementers and production systems today. So going back to the contents, you can see this next section is the specification, and this is kind of the meat of the IG itself. If we go through in order here, we can see that we start with actors. As we've discussed before, there is the server or the publisher, the client or the subscriber, and the endpoint. And we call them out as 3 pieces because they can be 3 pieces. Oftentimes you'll see that the client and endpoint are the same piece. So particularly when you talk about things like a Websocket connection, the client and the endpoint are going to be served by the same piece of software. But there are also scenarios where you say, for instance, the endpoint is an HTTP relay server that's translating the posted messages into push notifications for a cell phone. In that case, the endpoint is very different from the client, and we've generally found that it's easier to put things together in your mind than it is to try and split things apart. So we do describe some of that nuance in the text here. As we continue, the next section is this components, and again, I have discussed this in the previous video, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it does go through and describe the subscription topic, the subscription, and the notification bundle. I do want to make a note as well, because of those same build issues here, some of these links are not going to be working, like when you come here to subscription topic. So I will have links in the GitHub page that I link for the video, and all these kinds of CI and linking issues and things like that will all be resolved in the very near future, but not yet at the time of this video. So as we've discussed before, subscription topic is kind of defining the what is triggering a notification. This could be a resource and a type of change that's happening. This could be an event definition. This could be just a resource and an interaction, so saying that a particular type of resource is created or deleted. All those types of things go in the subscription topic. It does also define the filters that are allowed to clients. So again, using our perennial example of an encounter notification, it's very useful to, for instance, filter on the patient ID. It can be useful to filter on the patient group membership and some of those types of things. But you don't want to be able to do, tons of chaining and reverse chaining and all those things just arbitrarily from a client, because your server is not going to support them in a performant and scalable way. Something that has been recently added is that this defines the shape of the notification. And we'll look a little bit more in detail when we look at the resource, but essentially it's saying what is the root resource that notifications will be coming as, and what other resources may be present. This isn't restricted to just one type of resource. So if you say, for instance, I have a topic that is any resource is deleted. It's an internal workflow thing that I want to receive a notification anytime a resource is deleted. You might say, okay, in general, it's just going to be a resource and I don't really have much to follow from that. But if it's an encounter, I might also include the observations that were from the encounter, or the patient that is from the encounter, or things like that. So you can define the shape specifically for one type of resource, even if you have many types of resources in a particular topic. The how is it defined? This we've added here because to try and reduce confusion, but this is in the what's generally known as R4B, but it's R4 4.1.0. And this is the current draft of what will be the next point release of FHIR R4. So there's a link here that does not work yet because it hasn't been published yet. So the subscription resource, what is it? Well, as we've said before, it's a way to link a subscription topic to a client. So it's just saying, this is a topic I'm interested in, and here's how you can give me notifications. Here's the format I want, here's the amount of information I want, here's where to send it and how to send it and all of those pieces. Since we are in the backport, this is just going to go to the actual R4 subscription resource. So this link does work, and you can see it comes up in 4.0.1 instead of 4.1.0 because this is going to be unchanged. So in the point release, we're not allowed to make anything that could be constituted as a breaking change. And so here, the subscription resource stays exactly the same as it has been. In order to make it work, that's why we have the IG to support the new topic things. And then we have a lot of extensions and things defined that we'll get into here momentarily. So same thing, you can see how is it defined, and it's R4 4.0.0. You won't actually find 4.0.0 because 4.0.1 is a technical correction, but there were no changes to the resource. So any R4 subscription resource works here. The notifications, same thing. In as we've discussed before, this is just kind of the payload of the notification and the information about it. So it's telling you which subscription this notification is from. It's telling you if you have IDs, the IDs. If you have full resources, it has the full resources. All of those types of things that are in a notification. There's two pieces. The overall structure of the notification is a bundle, and this is just the standard R4 bundle. Again, we can't make any changes to any resources in a point release, so the link for bundle works. And it's just the bundle that if you're working in FHIR, you are most likely familiar with. We are using a history type bundle, and that's just to the one that gives us the most functionality that we wanted with all of the restrictions around it, and we'll get to that here in a moment as well. And then inside that bundle, the first entry, so entry 0, is this subscription status resource. And that's a new resource. So again, the link is not going to work today. If we do this, it'll give us a not found. And the links are available in the GitHub repo. And I will show that as we get to it. So this text here, all these things that they link to are walking through a lot of the same things that I just described. Talking about how subscription topics work. The goal is to publish these in the FHIR registry. So once the release happens, they can start being accepted into the FHIR registry. And that way there will be an easy way to search for, find, and implement existing subscription topics so that not everyone has to define the same things over and over again. Subscriptions themselves, just talking about how that resource works, and linking to the profiles that we'll get to that have the lists of all the extensions and the rules around what has to be supported. The next part here, this accepting subscription requests. This piece is from, it's just some workflow information, which is more in depth in the workflow section, but it just wants to call out kind of the high-level differences between the query-based subscription that is in R4 and what's available in the IG. And then same thing here, the subscription notification section is just going into a little bit more depth, talking about the bundle. We're using history bundles, and specifically there's a couple of invariants. They're listed as BDL3 and BDL4 for people who are interested in looking at them. But essentially all it does is it says that bundle.entry.request has to be present on every bundle entry. And that's just saying essentially the URL that triggered that thing to exist. So it's pretty straightforward. In the status, subscription status entry, just put out URL that goes to the status operation, since that's how you would generate one, for example. And then for additional entries, you can fill them out with whatever makes sense. So if your notifications are generated on puts of encounters or posts of encounters, that makes sense to fill out in there. And what I'm talking about, let me just open up a bundle in general here. Is this section here, this bundle.entry. And this is kind of the array of things that are in the bundle. There's a few pieces of information here. By default, pretty much everything is optional. There's some things like if you put the request, you have to put a method and a URL. And that's specifically what we're talking about. So as I mentioned here, these invariants that are listed down here as constraints. The descriptions are pretty useful. If you're familiar with the FHIR expression language, then this works just as well. But the plain text is pretty clear. Entry request is mandatory for these types. History is the one we're interested. and otherwise it is prohibited. And same thing, entry response is mandatory for batch response, transaction response, and history, and otherwise prohibited. So in our case, we needed to be able to put those things. Specifically, if you want to have a subscription around a resource that's deleted, that's very difficult to convey if you can't put anywhere that it was the result of a delete. And so that's kind of the short version of why we use history. And then the long version is that you'll have to fill out the request and the response in every entry that you add. It's not a very onerous task. Generally speaking, if you're processing this, it's because you have received a request. And so it shouldn't be too hard in the implementations I've done. It's been pretty straightforward to add. This last section here is just a note about scoping responsibilities. And this is important to note. The subscriptions framework is not reliable or guaranteed delivery. We're not defining mechanisms to say that if a notification is sent by a server, we have a 100% guarantee that it has been received and processed by the client. Those types of systems are fantastic and highly encouraged to develop and work on them, but as part of a core specification, that is well beyond the scope of what we're trying to work on. So in this case, it just has some notes that clients need to be aware that they might receive a notification twice, they might be missing some notifications, and things like that. And then servers should try to behave well as well. That if they're sending a notification and it does have an error in transport, to flag that and so on. So try to make it easy and kind of some general guidance, and then more detail is on the errors page that we will get to shortly. So workflow. This is just the general overview of how the system can work. In this case, I believe I chose a REST hook subscription type just because it's pretty clear and pretty familiar to most people. When we get into the channels, there are different ones for each type, and so that'll make sense as well. As we have in other sections, we have our three components: our FHIR server, our client, and our endpoint. In general, the kind of preconditions are here on the server. They have to implement the subscription functionality, they have to implement one or more subscription topics, and have all those things available for the client. In this case, it's just going to do a standard search on the subscription topic resource. There are search parameters defined on subscription topic. So if you're looking for a particular canonical URL or different things like that, you do have the ability to search for those on the client. And as always with any other search parameter or anything else, it's what the server actually supports. And so here it's just showing a straightforward get. At that point, the client will receive a bundle with subscription topics in it. If the client finds one that it's interested in, it'll go ahead and create or configure or initialize or whatever it needs to do for the endpoint. And then go ahead and create the subscription on the server. So this, in our case, typically is a post. And it'll just post and get the response back saying, was this actually requested? Is it active? So for instance, if you're sending email, you might set it directly to active because, well, I'm just going to send out to this email address and I'm not interested in more than that. Whereas you might say, oh, let's do requested in the case of REST hook so that I have the ability to go check and make sure the endpoint is working and everything else before I even set it to active. And again, we'll detail that in each channel type a little bit more. It could also be rejected. And so that's here in the workflow, you can see this alt. So it's saying that one of these two things could be happening. We could say that the subscription was accepted and okay, or we could say that it was rejected for any number of reasons. There could be something kind of painfully clear, like you sent a topic that the server doesn't support. in which case, obviously, the server is going to reject it. It could be more complex business rules that it says, you requested full resource over a REST hook, and I'm not going to allow that type, and I'm going to downgrade you to ID only. So in that case, same thing. The server might say accepted, but ID only, or it might just say rejected. And both of those are detailed options. And then if the channel supports it, and the server wants to do so, there's a handshake protocol so that it can test and make sure the endpoint is working. Down here, there's just the details talking about exactly what I just went through. So with the general workflow, that takes us into the channels. On this channel page here, there's first some discussion about how to decide what channel type is most appropriate. The TLDR, too long didn't read, is REST hook is almost always going to be the one you're looking for. Generally speaking, FHIR is RESTful, and generally speaking, people are familiar with it. There's infrastructure to support it. People don't have problems setting up servers. All of those types of pieces mean that, in general, if REST hook works, it's probably going to be the most straightforward to implement. One of the next ones to consider is actually WebSockets. And this is, again, it's described here in the text, but generally if you have something like a web client, a web client isn't going to be able to stand up an HTTP listening endpoint. It just can't do it. It's not something that's available that the server is going to be able to get to. And I put a little asterisk. It's obviously possible, but it's a very high bar. So in that case, the client will want to connect to the server via WebSockets because there's no additional responsibility for the client to set up something that can listen to receive the notifications. One of the next ones is email, and this is a lot of times kind of the lower bar, so to speak, and that's one of the most common use cases this has come up for is public health reporting, especially if you have things on the county level. That's one that's in the United States, kind of one of the smaller units of land government, if you're not familiar. But oftentimes, someone in that scenario is not going to have the ability to set up a FHIR server for sure, but even a REST hook is not something that they'll have the technical ability or funding to do. However, pretty much anyone can get an email address, and that's a pretty low lift. So that channel is defined in part of the core for those types of things because it was a common enough use case that we wanted to make sure it had first-class support. The other predefined channel type is FHIR messaging. And the only reason it's last is because if you're using FHIR messaging, you know that you're going to want FHIR messaging. And if you're not using FHIR messaging, it is probably not what you want. So as far as kind of the decision tree of finding it, it in a lot of ways can be first in that if you're already using FHIR messaging, you wouldn't even consider REST hook, WebSockets, or email. But for anyone who's not using it already, then it's probably not going to be what you're looking for. Another fun thing is that you can define custom channels, and when we do the reference implementation walkthrough, I haven't written up the full implementation guide for it yet, but I did define a Zulip channel so that you can receive notifications at chat.phir.org, and so you can make these custom channels to do things like that aren't in the core spec. From each of the defined channels, we have this same type of workflow graph that we just went through before. And you can see it's got the same actors. We have a FHIR server, we have a client, and we have an endpoint. But in this case, we have a little more information filled out because we know that the client endpoint, for instance, is HTTPS or HTTP, hopefully S. And we're clarifying that we're using the REST API on the FHIR server because we're not using messaging or any of these other things. We left off all the preconditions of supporting subscription topics and finding them and everything else in these just for brevity. So we start here from the client creating it, creating the subscription request. In this point, again, the endpoint is already up and listening, so that kind of would be a precondition that maybe could be shown here, that the client needs to have the endpoint set up before it sends the subscription request. In this case, the server saying it's requested is doing the handshake, and that is optional. And then from then on, the endpoint will be receiving notifications. They might be heartbeat notifications, and they might be event notifications. The event notifications are pretty straightforward. Those are the actual things that we're interested in this whole time, the events. The heartbeats are part of our error detection mechanism. And that's to say you can set up your subscription to time out once per day. So if you haven't had any activity in a day, it needs to send a heartbeat message. And in that case, that lets the client know if that amount of time has elapsed and I haven't received anything, then there's something wrong with my communication channel. So again, especially in the case when you talk about this might be a relay that's converting the HTTP messages into push notifications or something like that, the actual client doesn't have any way of checking this. Not that it doesn't have any way, but it wouldn't necessarily know that something was wrong here. And so this way it can say, okay, well, I haven't received anything in a whole day, and that is likely going to be something's wrong, and I can go check on the server to see. And that's talked about here in error resolution. We do have some security notes on each one. These are pretty generic, and on the security page we link out to the FHIR security guidance that definitely you should be familiar with before implementing any of these things. But in this case, it's just channel specific notes. So since we're talking about REST, we're saying don't use HTTP, use HTTPS. We're not actually prohibiting HTTP. Especially if you do things like empty notifications, there's no PHI in them. If they're intercepted, it's not any real security problem. And when you're testing, it would also be pretty frustrating if the standard prohibited HTTP, because then you would have to set up HTTPS endpoints just to do your testing. I won't go in quite as much detail for all of the rest of them, but you can see that that's the point of the IG here. In this case, we're jumping into WebSockets. I will note that here, instead of having a REST endpoint, it's the FHIR server WebSocket. And again, that's why we have the FHIR server REST API versus the FHIR server WebSocket portion. In WebSockets, one thing I want to call out is, other than creating the subscription, which we do normally, and finding where that the URL for that WebSocket endpoint, the client does have to go and use this operation get WebSocket binding token. So get WS binding token. And this is a way of putting some additional security on WebSockets. The WebSockets can be very long-lived sessions and might continue past the point that a normal REST token would be re-authenticated. And there's no real protocol for that within WebSockets because it's pretty low level and just sending messages back and forth between the client and the server. So this endpoint is an operation that's defined here, which we'll see the definition for shortly, which essentially says a client has to use the REST API to authenticate and prove that it's allowed to receive notifications on one or more subscriptions. So it'll do that during that time, and then the server just responds with the token and some expiration. The protocol defines how you then use that token to tell the server that you are interested in those subscriptions. And just like with REST, then we're looping receiving notifications, event notifications, or heartbeat messages. In WebSockets, the heartbeat messages in particular are pretty important to note because some infrastructure, especially when you're using cloud providers, that you have timeouts for inactivity on connections. And so you can actually use the heartbeat to ensure that you're receiving messages in less time than times out your connection. This whole thing is a loop because, as we mentioned, the WebSockets might last longer than a token lasts. And so at any point in time, while you're still connected, you can use your REST API to get a new token and put that while you're in the same connection, re-authenticate for one or more subscriptions. And that's important because we want to make sure that there's a straightforward way to make sure that clients aren't missing notifications. If you wait until this times out and then go and do this, then there could be a gap in time where you're not listening for events. Beneath the flowchart are the same descriptions that we just walked through step by step, and the same types of security notes that we have with the REST endpoint saying, yes, we should use WSS instead of WS. So secure WebSockets instead of just WebSockets. And then a little bit more about why we have the binding token operation. Email, same thing. This is just the channel definition. Here there's some additional information on how emails should be formatted. And essentially the guidance boils down to these two key points, which is to say anything in the message body should be human readable. Anything in the attachments should be machine readable. And the conformance there is just shall and should, because if you want to attach non-machine readable things as well, that's fine. But sending an email that has a message that's not for human consumption does not make sense. So along those lines is how you actually define that. And that's by setting the MIME type on the channel payload. And you can see these different string literals that would result in these different behaviors. So if you just told it, for instance, you want to text plain, you have a plain text body with no attachment. So you can imagine it's something like you've received activity on your subscription has happened. Click here, and that'll take you to a portal that you have to authenticate before you can find out what happened. Same thing with text HTML. And then you get into these two, which are the same things, text plain and text HTML, but they do have an attachment in FHIR JSON or FHIR XML. And this is just showing how, obviously we didn't put every combination of possible values, but it's showing how you would use these different formats. And then, as with the other channels, we have our workflow diagram. Again, we have our FHIR server REST API, we have our client, and in this case, we have an email server. So it could be SMTP, SMTPS, direct, all these things that are email protocols. And this is just covering the same thing that we want to send emails. We want to create a subscription. We may want to do a handshake. I highly recommend it for things like email in order to say, hey, this email address is being used, and here is the initial message. Gives you the opportunity to opt out, different things like that. And then the same type of loop, sending messages with heartbeats and event notifications. As we've discussed in some of these other ones, the amount of time in the heartbeat is very dependent on the channel. So when we're talking about REST hooks, we might want a day or a week, depending on how frequently we expect messages. When we're talking about WebSockets, you may want hours or minutes, or some section therein to make sure that things aren't timing out over your connection. And then you have things like email, where you might say, well, once a week, once a month. If I haven't sent anything, I need to send a message saying, hey, yes, this is still working. We have nothing to report this month. So you can kind of get a feel for that per the channel type. And then, as with the other ones, the same type of security notes saying don't send PHI over unsecure channels. That's really what it boils down to. And then FHIR messaging, same thing. We have the FHIR REST server, we have the client, but now we have a FHIR endpoint that is the client endpoint. And in this case, we're going to be posting process message operation. We're going to be using that process message operation to be sending our bundles through. And it's going to do the exact same process. We're going to create the subscription. We're going to post a handshake, which is optional. And then we're going to loop sending events and heartbeats. And same type of security notes here. So that is kind of the quick overview of the channels, which brings us into the notifications themselves. As we've mentioned before, the notifications are bundles. They're type history. Again, the links to the newer resources don't work, so you'll want to pull those from the links that are on the GitHub repo. And they do have lots of other information there. So for instance, the subscription status, if we jump over to that, and you can see this URL will probably be different by the time I post here, but it will be correct and maintained in the GitHub page. But this is just a standard resource definition in a part of FHIR. So here we can see it's a pretty small resource. There's not too much here. The first is the status, the subscription status actually, saying requested, active, error, off, or entered an error. Entered an error is just something that FHIR wants us to have. But in a handshake, for instance, you might have it in requested. Most scenarios you're going to have active, and then error and off are the special cases to say, I've tried sending and got, a certificate error, so I couldn't send the notification. Okay, I'm going to set an error on my subscription, and perhaps after that's happened for a few notifications, I'm just going to turn it off so I stop wasting resources. So those types of workflow things. There's the type of notification. So this is about this notification itself. And these are the ones we were just going through for handshakes, heartbeats, and event notifications. And so those are the ones we've already looked at, which is to say the handshake is the initial protocol exchange. The heartbeat is the yes, I'm alive, but don't have anything to send you. And the events are the actual events you're interested in. These other two, the query status and query event, are notifications bundles that are in response to specific queries. So when we get to the status operation on subscription, that's part of how the client can check to see if everything is working. You will get a query status bundle or notification. And when you are querying for events, which is an optional thing that servers can support if they want you to be able to replay events, then you get a query event bundle back. These two pieces, events and subscription start and events in notification. Actually, I'm just going to start with the events in subscription start here. This is the total number of events that have been fired on the subscription. So it's just a sequential number going up, and that's important for clients. And again, we'll get to it more in error detection, but so that you can see, I received event 20, 21, 24. Okay, well, obviously I missed some things in between. Let me try and figure out what I've missed and kind of go through some sort of resolution recovery protocol to figure that out. I do want to call specific attention to the type here, and that is a string. And that is because in R4, there's no 64-bit integer. In R5, that's the type we have, but in R4, that type does not exist. In JSON, 64-bit integers are actually kept as strings in order to make sure that they get parsed properly by the JSON parsers that are available in JavaScript and TypeScript and things. And so what we did is we left the type of string here, and if we look at the longer definition, it is not here. I have the wrong one, and I will make a note that we need to add it here, but it's just a 64-bit integer in this string. The number of events in this notification, this is just an integer because you're not going to have a notification that has more than that number of events in it if you do break it into 2 notifications. But we need to tell the client how many events are in here. This is particularly relevant when you talk about batching scenarios, and particularly when you get to like empty notifications. If I'm not sending you even the IDs of what happened, how do I want to tell you, hey, 10 events happened, or 12 events happened, or however many I ended up batching? That's how you find out right there. This section here is one of the sections we want to really focus on the Connectathon. And this is kind of a more detailed set of the event information. And that is to say the event number. This is the, oops, I'm sure this is the one that I was thinking of. Yes, note that this value is a 64-bit integer value encoded as a string. So that's the one that had that note, and I'll make sure to add it to the other one. But it's been brought up that particularly when you start talking about included resources and things like that, it can get very confusing. Which resource is the one that's triggering the event, which resources are just included because of it. Maybe I'm batching because I don't want to send more than 1 notification a minute or an hour or something like that. And how do I reconcile and kind of rebuild this graph of different events with different included resources that might overlap. So the resolution for that is this notification event backbone element, and it just has the event number, the timestamp of that event. So particularly if you're batching things that you're sending at the end of the hour, minute, day, whatever that is, now you have a place that you can put when that event actually happened. The reference to the focus, and the reference to any additional references. So these are 0 to many, so you can have no additional resources, or you might have many, but you can only have at most 1 focus. I will note too, we made these references to any because they could be non-FHIR things. So you can set up a reference to some external system that's non-FHIR, if you're doing some sort of event processing, and now you have a way to send that through. So this is a pretty new section of the notification, and so particularly in context of the Connectathon, we want to make sure that we are testing those things. These other pieces here are just kind of the general information, a reference back to the subscription, a reference back to the topic, and the, any errors that exist on the subscription. And this is important to note here for, again, if people aren't familiar, the subscription error codes that we have is an example binding. There is an effort underway to flesh this out with more errors, but just the types of errors that you might see are things like a DNS resolution error. The DNS record expired and we can't send a notification. I tried to send it and got no response. I sent an error. I sent a message and got an error back. Some of these types of things. And as kind of the examples get filled out, we might even be able to improve that into a little bit stronger binding, where we say these are the kind of suggested ones to use, but it'll always at least be extensible so that you can define your own errors that make sense, particularly if you have custom channel types. More than just the resource, this page does have, same thing, the boundaries and relationships, the scopes and usage that you would always expect, and then a lot of text describing the same things I just went through. If you want to read this, obviously, as I'm just talking, I may have missed little bits and pieces. I make every effort not to, but it does talk about things like detecting delivery errors and so on and so forth. The diagrams are not showing up because of the build things, and I will show those to you here separately because they are also in the IG. So that is the subscription status resource. We're in the notifications. Again, same thing, there's some discussion around this latest piece that we were adding about focus and additional resources and how they relate from the notification shape. Again, I want to call out servers may include additional resources. Just because they're listed in the shape, just because you think they exist, doesn't mean that they're going to be in the notification. So in the case of, for instance, an encounter notification, it's pretty reasonable that if you have the encounter, you might have the patient. Okay, yeah, that's probably a pretty reasonable expectation. You're not necessarily going to have it, but generally speaking, you will. You might have any medication orders that came with that encounter as part of the encounter close notification. Well, some medications can be marked sensitive. You might not have permissions to view them, things like that. And so in those cases, even though those resources exist, the server might not choose to do them. You also might have a topic that says include conditions that are the result of this, tied to this encounter. Well, if there are no conditions added during the encounter, then there wouldn't be any there. So this additional information is a very good hint as to what the server should try to send and what a client can expect to see. But it is, again, no guarantee that you will actually receive those things. So, payload types. That's kind of the meat of the notification. As we've discussed before, we have 3 notification types, empty, ID only, and full resource. And that's controlling how much information about the event is actually included. As we jump through it, it's pretty straightforward, and I covered it, I think, pretty well in the last video. Empty just doesn't have anything, ID just has IDs, and full resource has resources. Kind of the only thing I really want to note here is that we still have those restrictions on bundle entries. So we do have to fill out the request and response elements and things like that when you're constructing them. Conformance, this is pretty straightforward. If you have the new, we have a capability statement that you can go to list on your FHIR server that you instantiate, and that kind of is the short way of doing it. But essentially, it's saying you have to support the new resource subscription topic. Subscription status isn't something you can query for, so it doesn't show up in a capability statement. And then you have to have the operations that, the status operation, the query events operation is optional, so that one's not required, but how you would advertise those things and what's the minimum that you need to do to say you support this implementation guide. Additionally, some things aren't easily expressible in a capability statement. So in order to claim conformance, you also have to support at least one payload type and one channel type that are listed. And that's just because if not, I don't know, we wouldn't know what you're supporting. So the next section here is handling errors. And this we've talked about briefly here a couple of times that we've ended up touching on. But it's really comes down to these things like the event numbers. By having it be an increasing continuous set of numbers, you can see, for instance, the missing events that I talked about earlier, 20, 21, 23. We know that 22 is missing, and then we start whatever our recovery process is. So it might be that the server supports query events, in which case we can just go ask, what was event 22, and get some sort of response back. Or it might be just that you say, well, I'm looking at encounters. I'm going to go query the server for encounters and then kind of rebuild my state of the world. And that's beyond the scope of this IG to define. So another one here is the broken communication detection. So this is, again, when we're talking about things in particular like a REST endpoint that's converting it into a push notification or into a custom protocol or things like that, that the client itself might be disconnected from the endpoint and using some other channel of communication beyond it. Or, other things that can happen. Like we said, certificates expire, DNS errors, it's always DNS. So in this case, we see the client said, okay, I received event 20, event 21, and now it's been a whole day and I haven't gotten anything. Okay, well, I'm going to go ask the subscription for its status. I can see that the subscription in this case is in state error. It might be an error, it might be an off. It might even still be inactive if the server wants. But I can see it's tried to send me 23 events. So, same thing, I'm going to go through this recovery process. If the server supports events, event playback, I can go and ask what those events were. And if not, I'm just going to go and do whatever RESTful queries I need to rebuild my state of the world. And we kind of discuss that down here. Oops, handling errors, that was it. So, safety and security. Again, this is a relatively short page because the most important thing is here. You have to follow your FHIR security guidance, and you also obviously need to comply with whatever your local regulations, laws, etc. require. So we're not going to be able to detail any of that in here. But we do have some additional notes that are specific to subscriptions that you'll want to keep in mind, particularly things like, a client authenticates and creates a subscription. That subscription is often going to last longer than that authentication token. And so you always want to keep in mind how that interaction is supposed to work, whether it means the client has to come and periodically reset the subscription, that it defaults to off after some period of time, whether there's some additional security checking. However you're going to handle that in your implementation, we do want people to be aware of that. We do also call out that there's not a mechanism right now for putting secrets in FHIR resources. So don't put, for instance, your private key, or if you're using symmetric auth, the key in there, because anyone who has access to that subscription will be able to see it. Filing, I don't remember if I filed the ticket or not, I'll have to double check, but we are trying to put together a system so that you can have secrets in FHIR that in a way that makes sense. And if and when that happens, we will obviously update the guidance here. You also want to be careful about how notifications could be PHI in and of themselves. If you are sending notifications from a facility that treats addiction, sending those notifications from that facility kind of is PHI. And so you just want to be aware of how you're doing these, how you're sending them, where you're sending them from, where you're sending them to, and make sure you've taken steps that ensure that those things aren't leaking PHI where they're not supposed to. I think those are, and some of the other ones are, the next one here is just talking about how sometimes a notification shouldn't be sent, even though the event is triggering it. So for instance, if a patient doesn't have, if a user doesn't have access to a medication because they are, it's been tagged as sensitive for the patient, then prescribing that medication shouldn't send a notification to whoever is not authorized to see it. So you do have some security and scope interactions and things like that that you want to be aware of. Yeah, and then also of note is the opposite. If a client is just receiving these things like at a REST endpoint, you want to make sure that there's some sort of security in place that you can hopefully validate that that is an actual message you are supposed to be receiving. We are looking into things like the smart backend services authentication to help promote that, so we can ensure that the person sending the message was also the person that's supposed to. But in the meantime, you can put a long key in a header or something like that, keeping in mind it's not going to be secret right now, so you don't want it to be anything more than just saying, yes, this is the person I thought it was. You might do DNS reverse lookups, you might do any number of things, but be aware that that is an attack vector we've identified, is receiving fake messages from a server. And the danger there, just to highlight, is, for instance, if you're sending IDs and the application surfaces that and says, oh, here's the ID, you want to click on this link. If it's going to a server that's set to spoof the actual medical server, a client will likely authenticate with that. And if you go through and aren't taking care to ensure that you're actually against the original FHIR server, some of those types of things can show up for phishing attacks and different things like that. And then also be aware of denial of service and make sure you have some sort of mitigation if you're setting up a REST endpoint. Just general security practices should be followed when you set that up. All right, this next section here, and I'm just going to use the first link because of the way the navigation works, but this is all the FHIR artifacts. And so this is broken up into sections that are just categories of what the artifacts are. So you can see, as I mentioned before, we have a capability statement that we can go and look at. We have the operations that we have defined, the events operation, the status operation, getting a Websocket binding token. We have profiles on resources, so the subscription and the subscription bundle, or the notification bundle. And then we have all of our extensions. And so this is what we were talking about earlier, that we can't, since we can't change the subscription resource, we need things like, how do you specify a heartbeat period? How do you set the empty, ID only, or full, the content, payload content level of a subscription, timeouts, filtering, all of these things that weren't available in subscription need to exist as extensions. And there's the definitions for each one. So for instance, if we look at additional channel types in the R4 subscriptions, you could not define your own channels. We thought that was important to add. And so you can see there's an extension here. It has a URL, and in this case, it takes a coding so that you can define a new extension, or a new channel type. Apologies. There's value sets and code systems, which are for terminology. And then the kind of the most important are the example instances. And so here you can see we have a subscription, we have a bunch of notifications of different types so that we can see these. So for instance, kind of one of the, well, we'll start with the subscription. We'll just look at the JSON so we can see that. It is a subscription resource. This is a standard R4 valid subscription. It has meta, text, all the normal things. But you can see, for instance, the criteria here, and this is all described in the profile on subscription, but the criteria is the subscription topic. And this prevents the case where you send, since this isn't just a standard valid R4 subscription, if you send this to a server that doesn't support it, it's not going to understand this kind of criteria, and so it will just reject your subscription or fail. And so we kind of reduce the possibility of odd behaviors. On that criteria, we have an extension. So we were saying this is the topic, and now within that we are saying, and this has to scroll over, there you go, the backport filter criteria. And so in this case, we have the normal filtering criteria that we've established on this topic. So we said we can filter on the encounter by patient using the patient ID, and that is the exact filter we want on this subscription. There's the channel section, which we have filled out, for instance, for REST hook. We have the endpoint information, but then we have all of these extensions, like I was mentioning before. Scrolling over here is kind of awkward, but we have things like a heartbeat period, the timeouts, the max number of events we can send, and things like that. So all these things live as extensions on the channel. And then in the payload, where we say the content type, the MIME type, we also have an extension that gives us the content level, so the empty, ID only, and full resource. So you can see that's one of the examples here, and it does have the whole profile, here we go, in the backported R5 subscription, so that we can see exactly what we were talking about. Probably would have made sense to do this first, but you can see it's just a standard R4 subscription, and then we've added on criteria, we have backport filter criteria, we have on the channel, we have these things. So all of the different extensions that are there are in the profile. Same thing for the notifications. We'll do a straightforward one first. So we can see that this is just a handshake notification, and we can see there's a bundle. It's a history bundle, as we've been talking about this whole time. The first entry has to be this subscription status, so entry 0. And we can see that there is status of active, and the type is handshake. The status might have been requested, it might have been active. All of those are kind of up to the server how they do it. Obviously in this case, there have been no events sent, and there are no events in this notification because this is just a handshake, and there's references back to the subscription and topic. This is the piece that I kept referring to earlier. Since we're using a history bundle, you can see we have a request and a response, and these are mandatory to include. So in the case of the status, we just said, oh, well, it was like if you did a get on the subscription for status, and the response was a 200 that you received back. So that's a pretty straightforward one, and then you can see these kind of run the full gamut. We tried to have a pretty full set here of all the different ones, but in this case, this is, for instance, a JSON with multiple resources. So you can see that this one has, this is event number 2. This event, this notification contains 1 event, and then we can see we have this notification event block filled out. That we have the event number 2, when it actually happened, which resource was the focus, and then we have an additional context that is a reference to a patient. And then as we flow through the rest of the bundle, we can see that there's this encounter and there's this patient. So these examples should cover pretty much all of the different combinations of things at least once. So that's the idea. There you go. This one, I think, is the other one that's even, I think this is the most complex to say this is, oh no, this is the subscription for multiple resources. So that doesn't show us anything there differently. But same thing, if there's an example of something you're trying to figure out and it's not listed here, please let me know. We can go ahead and add that. And then the last page here is just the downloads. You can download a tar gzip version of the specification. It has all the FHIR artifacts that you need in order to do extended tooling, to grab all the URLs and things if you like. Generally, if you're interested in the package, you know what you're looking for. The examples, again, they're all listed on that page, but you can just download all the JSON or XML examples so that you can just have those locally and look through them. And then here is the actual copy of the specification, which is to say all the HTML pages and everything else. So with that, I don't think we went through too much on the subscription topic resource. Again, in the last video, we kind of covered most of what's in here anyway. It's a canonical resource that we're interested in, and in R4 that metadata type doesn't actually show up, so we're stuck with how it was available in R4. As we've talked about, we have these resource triggers that I want to highlight here. So we can say that we have an encounter that's created or updated and matches the status of in progress. And we can go through and describe all of those things. Or we can come through and say we have an event trigger. So the example I linked to is the HL7v2 event type codes, and it is just an example, but you might say, yes, I want to use any one of these events that are already defined in HL7v2. You might say, I'm forwarding Firecast events. You might say, these are my internal workflow events that I have defined for my hospital. Whatever those things are, same thing, you put a description, you put the event, the link to the event, and you do have to specify what FHIR resource is kind of the focus or key resource for that event. Same thing, we can establish what you're allowed to filter on. And so in this case, we're the one we looked at, the example before, for instance, we were saying encounter, we're allowing a filter on patient ID, and in that case we were actually saying we were checking for equality or we were checking for in, and the in is for checking to see if it's in a group. If you have groups of payers, if you have patient cohorts for different reasons, that's a pretty standard filter that you might want to expose. Again, in the context of the Connectathon, the notification shape is relatively new. And we do want to be testing that. We went through it in decent detail before, but essentially you just say for each type of shape that I want to define for this, there's this key resource, and that is the same resource that is used in an event, that is the same resource that is used in a event trigger, resource trigger, that's the same resource that's used in the filters, all these kinds of things that use the same thing to link, the same resource type to link, and then what additional includes might be there. And these are actually include directives, and we do have examples of this as well, which might make more sense. But if we look in JSON, we can see, for instance, here, same thing, this is just going through and using the example of one of these. So we have a resource trigger defined saying, oh, where an encounter resource is moving to the state in progress. We have some query criteria, some FHIR path criteria. We have an event trigger saying that this is patient admission according to HL7v2 ADT A01. We establish what filters we can use. And then we have this notification shape, and that's saying, yes, we're including the encounter because that's our key resource, but the server is also going to make an attempt to include patient, practitioner, service provider, account, diagnosis, observation, location. These are all resources that are listed in the HL7v2 mapping project for the A01 event, so that's why they are here. So that, again, in the context of the Connectathon in particular, we want to test that. So highly encourage doing that. And just like the rest of the FHIR resources, there is a wall of text going through everything I was just describing. This does have more information about how you can derive additional resources, are additional subscription topics. So say we have this pretty simplistic admission, and you say, well, I need to refine the FHIR path criteria so that it actually works in my system, or I'm going to add some additional filters because I have use cases that need them, and I've optimized that part of the implementation. You can derive from this canonical so that clients can still find that you're doing a patient admission and things like that. So that should cover all of those pieces. Perfect. So, especially looking at the time, and now I think that's a pretty decent run through of the implementation guide and the new resources that are added in R4B. Again, the previous video did have a general overview. In the next video, I think we're going to go through the reference implementation. And so that'll kind of put all these things into practice instead of just seeing examples, see how all of the moving pieces work. If you have any questions, comments, please reach out. Obviously, hope to see people at the Connectathon, but the reference implementation is up all the time for testing, and any feedback is good feedback. So other than that, see you next time. Cheers.